monarchy. A republic, replied the doctor, if you can keep it. From the notes of Dr. James McHenry, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. The COVID-19 outbreak has laid bare the state of oligarchy in America. While millions of Americans face bankruptcy and struggle to pay their mortgage or rent during this pandemic, a handful of oligarchs inside and outside the Trump White House have profiteered while also engineering huge power grabs. Using the COVID-19 crisis as an excuse, Trump issued an executive order to trash protective regulations that go back as far as the 1800s. The order reads in part, "The heads of all agencies shall identify regulatory standards that may inhibit economic recovery and shall consider taking appropriate action to temporarily or permanently rescind, modify, waive, or exempt persons or entities from those requirements, and to consider exercising appropriate temporary enforcement discretion or appropriate temporary extensions of time as provided for in enforceable agreements with respect to those requirements, for the purpose of promoting job creation and economic growth." Multiple states used the crisis as an excuse to tighten restrictions on women's right to abortion, while gun manufacturers and Trump-supporting white supremacist militia groups promoted the sale of millions of weapons. When polls showed that the majority of Republicans, living on a media diet of Fox News and right-wing hate radio, were willing to show up to vote in person, while the majority of Democrats were concerned about getting sick, Trump and the GOP worked as hard as possible to fight voting by mail. Trump used the crisis to shut down virtually all immigration and refugee settlement from non-white countries, while increasing the brutality of the treatment of children and families who had previously come to America seeking asylum. Under cover of helping Americans recover from the economic crisis caused by COVID-19, Trump, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican, Kentucky, and the GOP engineered a new $3 trillion giveaway to monopolistic corporations and America's billionaires, while tossing a few bones to average people. The Fed got into the act, buying trillions in corporate bonds to artificially inflate the stock market in the months leading up to Trump's re-election effort. To add insult to injury, Trump, McConnell, and the GOP launched a major effort to undo a century of consumer and worker protections by granting corporations immunity from liability to make it nearly impossible to sue them or otherwise hold them accountable for fraud, death, or disease. Trump also tried to put limits on the media, including social media, and his enemy of the people rhetoric led to more than half of Americans losing trust in fact-based news. Meanwhile, he succeeded in getting the U.S. military, the National Guard in this case, to attack people peacefully demonstrating in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., so he could have a photo op with a staffer's Bible. While the media focused on the photo op part of his action, his use of the military to trample on First Amendment rights in an American city is far more alarming. Each of these steps moved America deeper into oligarchy and closer to tyranny. Now that this Pandora's box has been opened, deep structural work is necessary to extract our government from the claws of this nation's oligarchs. Modern oligarchy erupts. This crisis didn't start with Donald Trump. The oligarchs who largely took over America's political system in the 1980s drew mostly from the Charles and David Koch strain of libertarians. David had run for vice president on the Libertarian ticket in 1980 on the platform of privatizing Social Security, ending Medicare and Medicaid, ending the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and all anti-pollution efforts, privatizing the U.S. Postal Service and pretty much every other government-provided service, and ending free public schools, all while cutting taxes on billionaires to nearly zero. As numerous writers have documented, Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right, is a great resource. The Koch brothers raised up a network that spanned the country, helping elect politicians in every state house and Senate in the country, as well as cementing control over the Republican Party and the U.S. Senate, most recently via their Tea Party. The result has been that since 1981, the GOP has opposed virtually every form of government function government preparation, and government taxation to pay for both. The Trump administration, dancing to this tune, shut down the two largest groups within the executive branch working on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. One in the Department of Homeland Security, and the other on the National Security Council. When, on December 20th, 2020, the first cases of COVID-19 were diagnosed in South Korea and the United States, the South Korean response was right out of the pandemic playbook. Yes, it was called that the Obama administration had left for the incoming Trump team. Within a week, the South Korean government had brought in 20 companies and commissioned them to invent, manufacture, and deploy virus test kits nationwide. A week later, nationwide testing was underway, and as a result, South Korea's hospital system never melted down, and thousands of lives were saved. The Trump administration, however, well stocked with people who were alums of Koch-funded groups and programs, or regulars on oligarch Rupert Murdoch's Fox News channel, chose to do nothing meaningful. Trump himself went on TV regularly and called the virus a Democrat hoax designed to hurt his re-election chances. He and Murdoch's employees ridiculed the nervous Nellies like Washington Governor Jay Inslee. He's a snake. And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. He has to treat us well too, both Democrats, for hyping the dangers to the public. There's a method to this madness, revealed by British Health Secretary Matt Hancock, and totally consistent with Trump's actions. And it goes way beyond simply letting thousands die to produce herd immunity. Republican and libertarian oligarchs believe absolutely in the magic of the free market. If there's a shortage of test kits, that'll drive up the price of them to where eventually there's enough money to be made that somebody will jump into the marketplace and start making them at scale. Ditto for ventilators, respirators, and personal protective equipment. Which is true, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. When discussing how a new technology might be brought to market, libertarian theology does a good job of describing the marketplace. When there's demand, manufacturers will step up to meet it. Sometimes that demand can even be stimulated by innovation and invention. But libertarians and Republicans apply this philosophy to government. And in doing that, the oligarchs of the GOP ignore the entire point of government, which is to anticipate and protect its citizens from risk. We don't wait to form a fire department until after there's been a brutal fire that takes out several homes. We don't wait to assemble an army until after we're attacked. And we don't wait for thousands of wrongful death lawsuits to work their way through the courts, the way libertarians say most issues should be resolved, before we enact and enforce laws to prevent corporations from dumping poisons into our air and water. Sadly, America's first billionaire oligarch president and the media oligarchs who supported him thought that the marketplace would solve every problem, and government, as St. Ronnie loved to say, just gets in the way. It's more important, in their view, for government to save the money that would otherwise be spent on regulatory agencies and preparedness, so that oligarchs' taxes won't go up, but their income will. America's oligarchs have used this rationale to hamstring government at the state level since the collapse of Reconstruction, which is why the South is still so poor and dysfunctional. Since 1981, it has been the dominant theme in Washington, D.C. as well, impoverishing the rest of America. Most Americans are so poor today, the result of 40 years of Reaganomic neoliberalism, that the loss of just a few paychecks can lead to homelessness. Had America's oligarchs not come to power with Reagan and later helped put Trump in the White House, many lives would have been spared. On the other hand, there may not have been as much profit as there was during the frenzy when states were bidding against each other on medical equipment, driving up prices, because the Trump administration chose not to plan or act when the crisis hit us. The presidency, Trump's playbook. The outcome of this takeover of Congress, the presidency, and the courts is a total defense of the oligarchy that has come to control the country. Oligarchy doesn't arise out of nothing, and neither do oligarchic tyrants. Both require an institutional infrastructure and plenty of people willing to participate in exchange for wealth, status, or power. As would-be tyrants are lifted to power by oligarchs, they take bite after bite out of existing institutions, twisting and turning them to their own ends. Oligarchs write laws, which are then passed by the politicians they own, that criminalize trivial things like drug use, that leave huge loopholes for multi-billion-dollar financial crimes that were once considered serious felonies. When an oligarch or a person owned by oligarchs becomes president, that person uses the police powers of our government to prosecute those challenging the oligarchy and protect those defending it. These prosecutions and defenses are then ratified by judges put into place by the oligarchy, and the news stories that may reflect poorly on the oligarchs are spun in ways that elide their role in the entire process. Similarly, as these would-be tyrants rise to political power, some people, Richard Nixon's former White House counsel John Dean calls them authoritarian followers, are so enamored by that power, so desirous of basking in its glow and bragging about access to it, that they'll do just about anything to stay part of the in crowd that the tyrant forms around himself. This is not a new or novel idea, by the way. In August 1989, my best friend, Jerry Schneiderman, and I spent the better part of a week sitting in outdoor cafes on the Buda side of the Danube River, eating extraordinary and cheap food, staying in a grand old hotel, and generally exploring Budapest. A few months earlier, there had been massive pro-democracy demonstrations involving hundreds of thousands of people demanding that the Soviet Union let Hungary go. The summer we were there, over 250,000 people showed up to hear a speech by 26-year-old Viktor Orban, a rising politician who would soon be a member of parliament. 9 months later, in May 1990, Hungary officially became a democracy and held its first real election since 1920. In 1999, it joined NATO, and in 2004, it became a member of the European Union. For 20 years, Hungary was a functioning democracy. Today, it's a corrupt oligarchy. In the 10 short years since he first became prime minister in 2010, Orban, now famously wealthy by Hungarian standards and an oligarch himself, succeeded in transforming his nation's government from a functioning European democracy into an autocratic regime of single-party rule. Orban took over the Fidesz party, once a conventional conservative political party like America's GOP, with the theme of restoring Christian purity and, as one Trump advisor claimed, promising to make Hungary great again. His rallies regularly drew tens of thousands. He campaigned on building a wall across the entirety of Hungary's southern border to keep out Syrian refugees, a promise he largely kept. His party's politicians altered the nation's constitution to legislate what we'd call gerrymandering and voter suppression, ensuring that his party, Fidesz, would win enough of the votes in pretty much every federal election to continue to hold power well into the future. He's now packed the courts so thoroughly that legal challenges against him and his party go nowhere. His oligarchic-run party has rewritten elementary school textbooks to say that dark-skinned refugees entering the country are a threat because it can be problematic for different cultures to coexist. Using this logic, he has locked up thousands of refugee children in cages. When the Hungarian Helsinki Committee said, "The indefinite detention of many vulnerable migrants, including families with small children, is cruel and inhuman," Orban said that the Syrian refugees seeking asylum would, as AFP noted, pose a security risk and endanger the continent's Christian culture and identity. He also said, "Immigration brings increased crime, especially crimes against women, and lets in the virus of terrorism." 5 years to the week before American white nationalist neo-Nazis rallied in Charlottesville, Virginia, and murdered pro-democracy activist Heather Heyer, a group of 700 right-wing patriots held a torchlit parade that ended in front of the homes of Hungary's largest minority group, chanting, "We will set your homes on fire." Orban's police watched without intervening. Earlier, Zsolt Bayer, one of the founders of Orban's party, had called the Roma animals, unfit to live among people. Orban refused to condemn him or the anti-Roma violence. He's handed government contracts to his favored few, elevating an entire new class of pro-Orban business people who have cemented control over Hungary's economy, as those who opposed him have lost their businesses, been imprisoned, or fled the country. Virtually the entire nation's press is now in the hands of oligarchs and corporations loyal to Orban, with talk radio and television across the country, singing his praises daily. Billboards and social media proclaim his patriotism. His media allies are now reaching out to purchase media across the rest of Europe to spread his right-wing message. In 2019, Orbán began dismantling the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, replacing or simply firing scientists, while he called climate change left-wing trickery made up by President Barack Obama. The world, particularly the European Union, has watched this juggernaut with increasing alarm, and even the EU's 2015 and 2018 attempts to essentially impeach Orbán backfired, increasing his two re-election margins as his handmaids in the media proclaimed him the victim of a European deep state and meddling Jewish foreigners, particularly George Soros, who ironically once paid for a young Orbán to study in Britain. Although he blasts Soros and his own country's Jewish leaders with anti-Semitic tropes, he was feted by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who called him a true friend of Israel. Orbán replied, "A Hungarian patriot and a Jewish Israeli patriot will always find something in common." During the summer of 2019, in the same month that Trump's ally, Rudy Giuliani, said he had a former Ukrainian prosecutor willing to testify that former Vice President Joe Biden was corrupt, Donald Trump invited Orbán to the White House for a state visit. Orbán has been one of Trump's two primary sources of false information about how Ukraine opposed or tried to sabotage Trump's 2016 campaign. At a rally 3 months before his White House meeting with President Trump, Orbán condemned countries that accepted refugees for producing mixed-race nations. Orbán continues to ruthlessly use his own nation's diplomatic and criminal justice systems to aid both domestic and foreign criminal oligarchs, having hired his own local versions of Bill Barr and Mike Pompeo. In March 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, Hungary's parliament, dominated by Orbán's Fidesz party, voted on a sweeping piece of dictatorial legislation. The law passed with a vote of 137 to 53. Among other actions, it 1. Suspends elections and parliament indefinitely. 2. Allows the government to jail for up to 5 years anyone who intentionally spreads what the government classifies as misinformation. And 3. Gives Orbán the authority to suspend laws by decree. Orbán, of course, didn't write this script. It's ancient, implied in the Epic of Gilgamesh and stories of some of the Hebrew kings in the Bible. Machiavelli wrote its field manual. It's how Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler came to power and held control of their nations. Today, it's a playbook being followed by President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, President Vladimir Putin in Russia, President Nicolas Maduro Moros in Venezuela, and others. It echoes how the Greek and Roman republics fell to tyranny, most infamously in the final rule of Augustus that ended the Roman Republic. Second American Civil War. The cover story of the December 2019 edition of The Atlantic, which was founded in the years just before the Civil War, was ominously titled, "How to Stop a Civil War." If we are indeed on the brink of a second Civil War, it's already being waged as a Cold War, with the occasional armed skirmish being provoked by the so-called alt-right movement, which, as of summer 2020, had murdered hundreds of Americans since Timothy McVeigh inspired the modern Boogaloo white supremacy era. And as in the past, this would be a war where the very, very rich, the oligarchs, pit Americans against each other, dividing us by class, region, race, and religion, simply to gain and hold more and more power and wealth. This is not the first time we've faced such a crisis as a nation. Each time, forces of massive, accumulated or inherited wealth have nearly succeeded in taking full control of our nation to replace a democracy, where the will of the people is accomplished through their elected representatives, with a form of government where most government functions reinforce the power, wealth, and control of the morbidly rich. This system of government is among the most ancient, stretching back 7,000 years, and is known to political scientists as oligarchy. Aristotle put it in context. Tyranny is a kind of monarchy which has in view the interest of the monarch only. Oligarchy has in view the interest of the wealthy. democracy of the needy. For oligarchy to totally take down democracy, only three things are initially needed. 1. Control of or substantial influence over a critical portion of the media. 2. Legalization of bribery of public officials so that oligarchs can achieve majority control of the legislative process. And 3. Control of the most critical parts of the court system so that they can influence legal processes. The fourth element, when the oligarchy is well established and the transition to tyranny begins, is seizure of the executive branch and the formation of a police state, principally using massive surveillance and selective prosecution against those agitating for a return to democracy. Arnold Toynbee is thought to have said, "When the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable." Most warriors are in their late teens or early 20s. By the time they've died, 3 more 20-year generations have come of age, suggesting, if Toynbee was right, a 4th generation, roughly 80-year gap between terrible, nation-altering events. In the era of the 1770s to 1789, foreign-aligned oligarchs controlled what we now call America. Believers in democracy fought a war to overthrow that British oligarchy. 4 generations later, in the 1860s, massive wealth was controlled by a few thousand very large plantation oligarchs in the South. The South was politically run as a full-blown oligarchy and police state on the verge of total tyranny, which it had been for Black people from the beginning, while the North was still largely democratic. The Gilded Age Northern oligarchs wouldn't fully emerge for another 30 years. The Civil War could thus be recast as a war between oligarchy and democracy, where democracy won by a whisker. 4 generations after that, the Republican Great Depression, what they called it until the 1950s, opened the door to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's war against the economic royalists, the oligarchs, which succeeded in putting them, at least temporarily, in a box, despite their explicit efforts, exposed by Major General Smedley Butler, to overthrow him by force. Today, 4 generations after that battle closed with the end of World War II, America's oligarchs succeeded in getting enough of their guys placed on the Supreme Court to legalize political bribery in 1976 and 1978, and the Buckley and Bellotti decisions, for the first time in American history. That event opened the door to this generation's oligarchic control of all 3 branches of government via the Reagan Revolution and the billionaire takeover of the GOP. All that was left was to get the populace to support a final transition to full-blown oligarchy, a task undertaken by oligarchs who controlled the media, largely through right-wing hate radio, thousands of right-wing websites, and the efforts of billionaire Rupert Murdoch with Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. As a result, the crisis of oligarchy in America is already upon us. The question is whether it will cement its place, or morph into tyranny, or whether we, the people, will turn it back, as we have done twice before in American history. Are we approaching the end of the great American experiment in representative democracy? Will our children and grandchildren live under a government of, by, and for the people, or a nation of, by, and for the monopolists and oligarchs, ultimately enforced by a brutal police state? To answer these questions, it is essential to understand the basic mechanics of the American government. There are functionally 4 branches of government in the American model, 3 explicitly defined in the Constitution, and the 4th protected by the First Amendment. For oligarchy to completely overwhelm and ultimately destroy our democratic republic, turning it into a tyranny, each of these 4 must be seized by the oligarchs and turned to their service. The 4 branches are the legislative, executive, and judicial, followed on by the media, often referred to as the Fourth Estate. The media have always been the initial pivot point, though, for control of public opinion, and through that, control of the government itself. Control the media. The First Amendment specifically prohibits Congress from abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and the telecommunications laws from the 1920s and 1930s kept most newspapers, cable systems, internet providers, and radio and TV stations locally owned, to prevent oligarchs from asserting singular control over information and news across our nation. All that changed in 1996 when the Telecommunications Act was enthusiastically signed by President Bill Clinton. The act was the result of tens of millions of dollars of telecom industry lobbying, and thus was supported by bought-out majorities of both parties in the House and Senate, passing despite outspoken dissent from Representatives Peter DeFazio, John Conyers, and Jerry Nadler, and Senators John McCain, Robert Byrd, and Bernie Sanders, and a handful of others. The act wiped out those protections for local media, turning our nation's cable systems, internet service providers, newspapers, and radio and TV stations over to a small handful of media oligarchs. I worked in radio and TV back in the 1960s and early 1970s, first as a DJ, 3 years, and then doing news, 7 years. I started as a weekend DJ at WITL, the country station in Lansing, Michigan, which was owned by three guys. An engineer, a salesman, and a businessman with a radio background, who had started the station from scratch in the 1950s. From there, I went to WVIC, which was owned by a Michigan family. From there, I went to WJIM TV, a station whose call letters were named after the infant son of the family that owned it. I ended up back at WITL for years, doing morning news. These stations were all locally owned because telecommunications laws dating all the way back to the 1920s required local ownership. No one entity could simultaneously own a media market's radio, TV, and newspapers, and no one entity could own large quantities of radio stations around the country. Not only were all of those stations owned by local folks, but they all had local news operations that were enthusiastic about investigating and outing local corruption, and they provided a vital public service when there were local emergencies, be they tornadoes, massive traffic accidents, or toxic industrial spills. The broadcasting of actual news was required by the FCC through something called the Fairness Doctrine, which required stations to program in the public interest, a mandate that the FCC interpreted as required.
Those of y'all in the clouds, hit that like button, because I got that fire over here. Like, share, subscribe. How about that? I have to pay for these audio books. Y'all could at least hit the like button to get me in the algorithm and push me out there. Can you do that much?
Bring both national and local news at least every hour on radio, and at least 1 hour, split 50-50, local, national, during prime time on TV. The Fairness Doctrine also required stations that aired editorials from the station's ownership or management to be balanced with equal time by an outside source, offering an opposing point of view. The result of these two sets of restrictions was a diversity of viewpoints, basic standards of honesty and fairness for news operations, the strengthening of democracy through an educated and informed electorate, and a local programming focus that served the needs of every community in America. In 1987, Reagan ordered the FCC to stop enforcing the Fairness Doctrine, and in August 2011, it was removed from the FCC's rules by the Obama administration. The telecommunications laws regarding station ownership and media concentration from the 1920s through the 1930s and 1940s were all largely repealed when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996. As a result, unprofitable news became very profitable infotainment, and radio and TV stations no longer had to pay for their monopoly use of our public airwaves with programming in the public interest. Clear Channel, a regional owner of a handful of radio stations, went on a buying spree right after Clinton signed that legislation and ended up owning 1,225 stations in 300 cities and towns, dominating the radio markets in 100 of the nation's 112 major media markets. Several other big companies jumped into the fray, with one, Cumulus, owning more than 400 stations across the country, including some of the nation's largest. None of the stations I worked for in Lansing back in the day are still locally owned, as far as I can tell, with an internet search, There's not a single locally owned station in the entire capital city. And that's not just true of Lansing, Michigan. Locally owned stations are an absolute rarity in today's America.
I'm talking to the ones in the clouds, real.
Is that an entire city can have multiple radio stations with few to no local people actually broadcasting live on the air. As Mark Fisher wrote in the Washington Post in 2003, speaking of the death of local news and community-based broadcasting, consolidation and cutbacks in local staffing have eliminated many of those functions. The prime example wielded against the industry stems from an accident last year in Minot, North Dakota, where Clear Channel owns all 6 commercial stations. When a train derailment in the middle of the night released a frightening cloud of anhydrous ammonia, Minot police sought to notify the citizenry of the crisis. They called KCJB, the station designated as the local emergency broadcaster, but no one was home. The station was being run by computer, automatically passing along Clear Channel programming from another city. One person died from exposure to ammonia, and several others were hospitalized. When Air America started broadcasting in 2004, it was carried on radio stations owned by Clear Channel in cities across the country. After Mitt Romney's Bain Capital took over Clear Channel, there were only a few stations in the company. Now, iHeartMedia, still broadcasting progressive shows like mine. Similarly, a few years back, I met one of the owners of Cumulus in the offices of a U.S. senator, who inquired if the network, which had just purchased Westwood One, the company that syndicated the only progressive lineup in America, would be putting progressive programming on any of their 400-plus stations. No way, the billionaire network owner told us both. He said he'd never put shows on his stations that were hostile to business and wanted to raise my taxes. Over lunch at a Talkers magazine convention of radio hosts and owners in the later years of the first decade of the 2000s, I chatted with a senior executive at Salem, a company that made its first money publishing Bibles and religious tracts, but then diversified into owning large radio stations in nearly every consequential city in America. A group of Salem employee talk hosts, most prominently Dennis Prager and Hugh Hewitt, broadcast daily hard right-wing shows from coast to coast, and I asked him if he'd consider adding a progressive show like mine. Not a chance, he said. We're a Christian company, so we'd never consider a liberal on our airwaves. When I protested that I was a Christian myself, he said it wasn't possible for a liberal to be a true follower of Christ. Thus, in every nook and cranny of America, you can tune across your local radio dial and find an oligarch-friendly conservative talk show host of one sort or another. Progressives, who actually try to put into action Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 25 and the Sermon on the Mount, are on the air in only a handful of cities, almost always on locally owned stations. Our TV markets are similarly concentrated, with the most notorious television monopoly being Sinclair, which owns more than 200 TV stations across the country. Newspapers are similarly concentrated in ownership, with few local papers of any significance surviving, as are the cable, TV, and internet service providers. The outcome of all this corporate ownership of media, in nearly all forms, is that the storyline preferred by oligarchs, many of them media oligarchs, is constantly available to Americans. But the voices that would challenge oligarchy and promote democracy are limited to struggling nonprofit entities like the Pacifica Network for radio and Free Speech TV. Roughly 90% of American media, by viewership, readership, and listenership, is owned by only 6 companies. A small handful of media executives decide what we'll see, hear, and read. And although some have a political agenda, in every case their support of their own monopolies in the media world is legally their first priority. That means oligarchy-friendly media. Meanwhile, oligarch Rupert Murdoch and his sons continue to pump out a steady stream of pro-oligarchy news on their Fox News channel, available to pretty much every cable household in America at no additional cost. MSNBC is often only available with premium cable packages at an extra cost, although it rarely challenges the oligarchs, being owned by the largest internet monopoly in the country. Control of a big chunk of the fourth estate, essential to launching and maintaining oligarchy, has largely been accomplished and has been the single greatest factor in the crisis of widespread support for pro-oligarch, anti-democracy policies and politicians. The next stage may be even more ominous, as on May 29, 2020, Trump's Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, authorized any foreign oligarch or government via an oligarch to own any U.S. media, doing away with the previous 25% foreign ownership cap. The elimination of that cap was put into place at the explicit request of Cumulus Media, the second largest owner of American radio stations, and at the time in deep financial trouble, looking for a buyer, but the ruling applies more broadly. In the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court case of Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, Justice John Paul Stevens wrote in his dissent that the decision would have accorded the propaganda broadcasts to our troops by Tokyo Rose during World War II the same protection as speech by Allied commanders. More pertinently, they would appear to afford the same protection to multinational corporations controlled by foreigners as to individual Americans. He was ridiculed for the statement in the conservative press at the time. President Obama echoed Stevens in his subsequent State of the Union address, saying, "Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law to open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections." Justice Samuel Alito mouthed, "Not true," for the cameras, but Alito's denial aside, Stevenson's prediction has fully come true. While it's unlikely that Japan is interested in buying 1,000 American radio stations or a TV network like CBS, Russia, China, or even Saudi Arabia, a citizen of which once owned 7% of the company that owned Fox News, divested only after 9/11, may well be our next source of news, shaping and informing American public opinion on everything from foreign policy to whom we should elect. Trolling Congress, both federal and state. For rule by the rich, also known as oligarchy, to really and truly seize control of a nation, that nation must first legalize bribery of politicians by the oligarchs themselves. We are now fully there in today's crisis of oligarchy, although through the centuries, America had consistently resisted rich people and corporations owning politicians. One of the most famous stories of our resistance to oligarchy was when the U.S. Senate refused to seat copper baron William A. Clark in 1899 because he'd openly bribed some of Montana's state legislators to send him to Washington, D.C. This was before the Constitution was amended to allow for the direct election of U.S. senators. Clark's story was one of the events that pushed the nation toward that amendment. In 1907, at the urging of Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, Congress passed the Tillman Act, which made it a felony for any corporation to contribute anything of value to any campaign or politician running for federal office. Most states adopted similar laws. Former House Majority Leader Thom, for example, was prosecuted for money laundering corporate campaign donations under Texas's version of the Tillman Act. Following the Nixon bribery scandals of 1974, Congress passed a number of good government laws limiting the ability of oligarchs or their corporations to fund federal politicians, as well as expanding a 1966 law that provided for public financing of presidential elections. But most all of that crashed and burned in 1976 and 1978, when, in a pair of decisions known as Buckley and Bellotti, Buckley v. Vallejo and First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that when American oligarchs owned politicians, it wasn't corruption or bribery, but instead First Amendment protected free speech, in Buckley, that was also available to corporations, in Bellotti. Those decisions unleashed a flood of money that, in the 1980 election, just 2 years later, swept Ronald Reagan into power and kicked off the modern era of American oligarchy. At the state level, a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, was incorporated as a nonprofit in 1975 by conservative oligarchs and the businesses that made them rich. Today, it has more than 2,000 state legislators, all but a handful of them Republicans, who meet several times a year with hundreds of corporate lobbyists to take corporate lobbyist-written model legislation that ALEC-funded legislators then introduce into their state legislatures. 98% of ALEC's funding comes from corporations, corporate trade groups, and corporate foundations, and their oligarch-owned or influenced state legislators keep a steady stream of pro-oligarchy legislation flowing through state assemblies and state houses. While they've been operating quietly this way since the 1970s, the organization became well known in early 2012 when George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin and then claimed as his defense Florida's Stand Your Ground law, an ALEC-produced piece of legislation written by ALEC member gun manufacturers. When in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed and expanded on Buckley and Bellotti in its sweeping Citizens United decision, the oligarchic takeover of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate and most state legislatures was complete. Today, if you're a billionaire, you can easily get pretty much whatever legislation you want passed, up to and including a $4 trillion transfer of borrowed taxpayer money to the top 1% and their corporations during the Trump years through his infamous tax cuts and GOP rigging of coronavirus bailout bills. But average Americans? What they want is largely ignored by the entire GOP and a sizable minority of elected Democrats. Average Americans, after all, can't donate millions to politicians' super PACs or give fat government contracts to politically connected companies. As researchers Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page documented in 2014, the probability of legislation passing that comports with the desires of the economic bottom 90% of us is less than random noise, and has been that way since the Reagan Revolution, while the wishes of oligarchs and their groups like ALEC are routinely passed into law, creating a crisis of governance. These the courts. America's court system was conceived by the framers of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to behave in the spirit of, as James Madison wrote of senators in his notes, the impartial umpires and guardians of justice and general good, a phrase that Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts echoed in his own Senate confirmation hearings. But since American oligarchs took Lewis Powell's 1971 advice to seize control of every branch of American government, along with the media, schools and colleges, etc., our courts have been largely turned into political institutions, combined with legalized bribery for legislators and oligarchs owning most of our media in all forms. This conversion of our courts from umpires into advocates for oligarchs has largely frozen, and in many cases reversed, nearly 100 years of progress in the arenas of human, civil, community, and environmental rights. This court packing reached its zenith between 2014 and 2020, with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's refusal in 2016 to even hold hearings for President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, after blocking Obama's lower court nominees for several years. That obscene and nakedly unconstitutional behavior was followed by McConnell's introducing a flood of unqualified and nakedly partisan candidates for lower federal courts. Prior to this era, nominees were typically vetted by the nonpartisan American Bar Association. But McConnell changed all that, turning instead to the Federalist Society, which his oligarch patrons had founded and financed. The Federalist Society was started with a grant from the hard-right Olin Foundation in 1982 in the early years of the Reagan Revolution, and this private, oligarch-funded organization today largely controls the Republican appointment of judges across the nation. During the Obama presidency, McConnell so effectively blocked Obama's judicial nominations that today, almost 30% of all U.S. Circuit Court judges with federal lifetime appointments were put there by Donald Trump after they climbed through the ranks of the Federalist Society. Many are young, rarely over 50, with some in their 30s. Federalist Society member judges and Federalist Society Attorney General William Barr have been very effective at blocking Democratic efforts to uncover corruption within the Trump administration, giving that billionaire oligarch near total immunity from investigation and prosecution during his term in office. This isn't just the effort of the Federalist Society, Trump or McConnell. It started in 1971 with Lewis Powell's infamous memo and led straight to a series of presidential elections stolen by collaboration with foreign governments, Nixon, Reagan, Trump, or outright fraud, George W. Bush, Trump, providing Republican presidents an opportunity to pack the Supreme Court in ways that wouldn't have happened otherwise. As a result, and because of the doctrine of judicial review that I describe in detail in The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, our court system today most often sides with oligarchs over average citizens, multinational corporations over communities, and raw assertions of billionaire power over the ideals of democracy.
I got that fire over here. This is your girl, Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach. If you like this content, hit that like button, share, subscribe, drop a comment down in the box below, Ashe. Because I got diamonds over here. I got the real deal Holyfield.